Thank you for the kind introduction, Claire. It's lovely to be with you today. What I'm going to talk about over the next 35 minutes is really try and adapt what I argue in the book to speak to the theme of this conference, which is about the future and about where we're headed. And I'm going to try and do two things to try and satisfy everybody. If you've read the book, I'm going to try and elaborate on it and speak to where I think the divides that I point to in the book are going in the future. And if you've not read it, I'm going to also try and provide a synthesis of what I argue in the book, so you can at least leave here today with a sense of that argument. There's obviously a lot more in the book. So essentially, I think the starting point for me, looking back at the last 13 years, has really been these three big moments that have thrown light on the fact that millions of people want a very different future, a very different kind of future in this country. And they were all imperfect vessels for that yearning for something different. The first was Nigel Farage and the populist rebellion in really between 2004 and 2014. The second act in this trilogy was the vote for Brexit. And the third act was the post-Brexit political realignment of the country that found its expression in the 2019 general election with the fall of the Red Wall and some remarkable shifts in electoral politics that we hadn't really seen for a very long time. And I view those three things really as part of a broader pushback among a cross-class coalition of voters, working class voters, non-graduate voters, older voters, not exclusively, but mainly those three groups, pushing back against a revolution, a political and cultural revolution that has been sweeping through this country for much of the last 50 years. And in essence, that revolution is really about this group that I call the new elite. And before anybody raises the obvious question, which lots of people raised when the book came out, well, hasn't Britain always had an elite? And that's absolutely true. What I think is going on today is that really British politics, our prevailing culture, the institutions, the creative industries, the media, Westminster, the epistemic class has essentially been captured by a new elite in this country. And who are the new elite? They are predominantly university graduates from Oxbridge and or Russell Group institutions. They typically come from families who already belong to the professional managerial class, so they've either got economic security or they've enjoyed a relative affluence. They tend to live in the big cities, university towns. They tend to work in the knowledge sector, the creative sector. They tend to work in interactive roles. They're sort of doctors, university lecturers, professors. They're often in the public sector. And crucially, unlike the old elite, the old sort of Tory elite, crucially, the members of this new middle-class professional group have been drifting rapidly leftwards on cultural issues over the last 20 years, or what David Shaw and others in the United States would call the Great Awakening of white graduate liberals. This is not a new trend. Daniel Bell in 1972 in The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, which is a fantastic book, by the way, talked about the rise of the adversary class. And what Daniel Bell was really pointing to in America in this case was the rise of a new professional class that was mainly deriving status, esteem, honor, and a sense of moral righteousness by essentially critiquing, if not attacking, the prevailing culture. And that adversary class was sort of becoming quite at home within the capitalist system. Chris Lash, who many of you will have read, Revolt of the Elites, made a similar argument on his deathbed in 1991, again pointing to a group that was more interested in attacking its own culture and deriving status from that, or certainly deriving status from its horizontal relationship with other elites rather than from its vertical relationship with the people. And the new elite really is an extension of that. But there are some important differences from what those writers argue and what I argue. What are those differences? Well, the first is If you look at those big three rebellions that I mentioned, the new elite really have responded to those by doubling down on their existing belief system, which is social liberalism, but also increasingly radical progressivism, or what we might call woke politics. Radical progressivism is a distinctive ideological current. I appreciate not everybody in the room will agree with me on that, but I think it is fundamentally different from social liberalism. It is revolutionary, it is radical, it prioritizes fixed group identities over individual rights, it is skeptical, if not hostile, towards the objective scientific method. It has really no interest in our shared identity and history. If anything, it wants to deconstruct those things in order to pave the way for this radical progressive utopia. If you look at serious surveys of Britain's population today by groups like More in Common, an independent civil society organisation, and if you look at other surveys that I use, the British Election Study, the British Social Attitude Survey, the percentage of Britain's population that are now radical progressive, not just socially liberal, but radical progressive, is somewhere between 15 and 20%. Bobby Duffy at King's will say it's about 23%, More in Common will say it's about 15%. But what I'm talking about here is a subgroup within this new elite who believe Britain is institutionally racist, who believe that minority rights have not gone anywhere near far enough, who believe that racism is prevalent, it's constantly present in every interaction in society, who think that we cannot move forward as a society unless we revisit historic injustices that happened hundreds of years ago, and who fundamentally view British society through the lens of critical race theory, a very binary, divisive, simplistic worldview where there are simply oppressors who belong to the white majority and victimized minorities, and that we should essentially elevate minority rights over the majority, and if we need to, we should curtail free speech and free expression in the name of social justice, which is essentially what you saw, I would argue, with Coates and Nat West. So this new elite altogether represents about a quarter of the country. If you read the new class politics by Jeff Evans and James Tilley at Oxford, they estimate that the new middle class graduate elite represents 25% of Britain, has been rapidly growing, includes not just lots of professionals and men who have done well, but also now increasingly lots of professional women, especially in the public sector. And within that group, about 15% are what we might call radically progressive or radically woke. And over time, this group has been accumulating power. They are the group that David Brooks in the US has called the Bobos. On the one hand, or the bourgeoisie bohemians, on the one hand, they have enormous financial power and resource. On the other hand, they increasingly identify themselves through their socially liberal, radically progressive tastes and lifestyles and opinions. They are who David Goodhart has referred to as the anywheres, who put much less emphasis on their ascribed identities, on their national belonging, on their local belonging, on their class and other such attributes. They are much more focused on their achieved identities, on their identities as highly educated liberal graduates who Rune Stubager in Denmark, a very interesting researcher, has shown that now what's happening among elite graduates is they are essentially adopting their education identity as the primary marker of who they are. It's more important to them now than traditional conceptions of class. It's more important to them than their citizenship. They are first and foremost members of the elite graduate class who increasingly, as I argue in the book, and I give you the footnotes to the studies in the book, increasingly look down on members of the less well-educated groups because they are now seen as being morally inferior, as not having the right identity, as being a part of this highly educated graduate class. And over time, they've been consolidating their power in mainly three ways. They've been consolidating their power through expanding the higher education system, which has disproportionately over the last 40 years benefited their children more than it has, for example, children from the working class. If you look at research by Vicky Bolivar at Manchester, she shows how over 40 years the expansion of higher education under Blair mainly benefited children of the new middle-class graduate elite at the expense of many others. For example, kids from the mainly white working class, not exclusively, who are now always the worst performers at every level of Britain's education system, contrary to what we often hear. And the new graduate elite have consolidated their power by continuing to reshape our society around this university-based meritocracy, which has left many people with an understandable sense of a feeling that they are no longer really deserving or winning within this system. Or as Michael Sandel has written in The Tyranny of Meritocracy, this has fueled what he calls the politics of humiliation, a sense among many people that the only definition of success in our society is having the right degree from the right university and holding the right set of socially liberal, if not radically progressive values. And if you don't meet that definition of success, then you are increasingly seen as a morally inferior member of our wider community. And secondly, they've consolidated through geography. The new graduate elite have hoovered up the economic, social, and cultural power that comes from living in the big cities and the university towns. Yes, there are lots of disadvantaged people who live in London and Manchester and Birmingham. But overall, over time, the new graduate class are basically colonizing the main epicenters of Britain's economic growth. Just one stat to bring that home, of all the students who graduate from Oxbridge or Russell Group institutions with a first class or 2-1 degree, 60% are living in London within 2 years of graduating. So there is an enormous pull factor as they go into the cities, and then over time, what we're left with is not just educational polarization between non-graduates and the more elite members of the graduate class, but that is now being compounded by geographic polarization between the smaller towns, the medium towns, the countryside, the coastal communities that are more non-graduate, more working class, and the cities and the university towns that are increasingly now dominated by members of the graduate class who tend to then colonize the institutions of power. They're more likely to socialize with other members of the elite graduate class. They're more likely to marry other members of the elite graduate class. As Mike Savage has shown at Manchester, they're more likely to socialize and close off their social networks to people who come from other backgrounds. So over time, this group is becoming more socially, culturally homogenous, but also more powerful as they're dominating the institutions and the urban centres. And if you want a really interesting book on the dynamics of this, Twilight of the Elites by Christophe Gouillet, who's a French geographer, talks about the divide between the new metropolitan centres and what he calls the periphery, the people who have been banished to the outskirts of the big cities, who have been banished to the small towns, who were told that their areas were going to get levelled up, but actually then really got nothing serious at all, just a very lightweight redistribution of civil service departments and a little bit of money here and there, but there was no redistribution of power. There was no redistribution of real tangible resource. So over time, they've been consolidated by education, their grip on the university system and meritocracy. They've consolidated through geography, and they've also consolidated through politics. Consistently, the new graduate elite, as we saw with this NatWest case, by the way, as we saw with Emily Maitlis's reaction to that case, they are consistently the most politically intolerant group in society. And I've linked to this in my Substack. I almost write a piece every other week about it because I'm so obsessed with getting this evidence out there. Members of the new graduate elite are more likely to unfriend people on Facebook, more likely to block people on Twitter, more likely to say they would be unhappy if their son or daughter married somebody from the other political tribe than anybody else in society. Elite Remainers with university qualifications were the most likely to say they would feel upset if their son or daughter married a Brexiteer. Brexiteers basically didn't care. About 40% of Remainers said, I would feel pretty upset, traumatized if my son or daughter married a Leaver. About 1 in 10 Brexiteers said, they would care. Now that's, on one level, very funny. On another level, that's why the institutions are so exclusionary. It's why people who have different views and values are being stigmatized and silenced. It's why, as Kemi Badenoch said in the Times today, the Free Speech Union has worked on 2,000 cases of people who have been penalized for expressing entirely lawful views and beliefs. Yes, it's amusing, but the new elite are intensely intolerant of people who hold different political beliefs, which is why they hated my book. But by becoming so vocal, I think in a way they also made that point for me. So over time, what has happened, at least what I'm arguing, is through this consolidation of power, this group has alienated much of the rest of the country. This is not a conspiracy, right? If you talk to academics on the left in the United States, people like David Shaw, they will tell you that the biggest challenge facing Western democracies today is what they call education-based polarization, the way in which non-graduates or graduates from less prestigious universities are moving away, well, are standing still, but elite graduates from prestigious Ivy League institutions, Oxbridge institutions, are drifting away from other educational groups when it comes to cultural issues. Less economic, cultural issues, identity, belonging, immigration, racism, minority rights, those kinds of issues. And so as we're living through this coming apart, as Charles Murray would have called it in his book by the same name, what I'm arguing is, as that is happening, the elite graduate class are taking the institutions with them. It isn't a conspiracy, it is just education polarization. So if you're in the BBC, and the vast majority of senior positions are owned by people who went to the same private school as you did, the same elite university as you did, who have the same parental background as your mum and dad, who have the same sets of values. Over time, in those culturally homogenous institutions, people basically radicalize and they drift further away from the average voter, which is why every morning as a test, the first thing I look at on the internet is the BBC homepage. And it's like a sort of, it's a world into how the new elite see the world. And it is, from beginning to end, it's a kind of obsession with identity politics and net zero and conservative policies being derided as all kinds of forms of extremism. But over time, this group is basically moving away from everybody else, which is why we've seen this attempt at a realignment or an attempt at a very different future. Because the new elite have really lost millions of people in three specific areas. They've lost them in terms of the values that they hold and that they're now imposing on the rest of the country. In particular, a complete and relentless commitment to mass immigration, to a political economy that is built on importing cheap migrant labor in the interests of big business and at the expense of the ordinary British worker. That is what is happening today. Our political economy is completely broken. Not only mass migration, an ongoing commitment to hyper-globalization, to the deregulation of finance, to the liberalization of the market, to consistently prioritizing global business over the interests of the national community, even when, and I think some previous speakers touched on this, much of the evidence in economics now shows very clearly that the model of globalization that was embraced from the 1980s until the 2000s had disproportionately negative effects on working class voters, non-graduates and older voters in Western economies. Much like, if they're being honest, the experts will tell you, the evidence on mass migration shows quite clearly it's had disproportionately negative effects on working class voters, non-graduates and others in Western economies. Now, a lot of that is either downplayed or ignored because it doesn't fit the script. But when voters are saying, hang on a minute, I don't think this revolution has been helping my group or my community, they're absolutely right to think that way. David Autor, among others, has shown how hyperglobalization undermined the social fabric of communities. It elevated rates of divorce, family breakdown in working class communities. It fueled higher rates of addiction, alcoholism, drug addiction in many of those same communities. And so where I lose patience with conservatives is when they talk about hyperglobalization and free trade in purely economic terms without even bothering to think through what the social and cultural effects of those policies have been, because they've been profoundly negative and they've undermined, if not completely eroded, many things conservatives should ordinarily care about. It's not only the values of social liberalism that have been imposed, it's also, I think, increasingly the values of radical progressivism. And I'm a big fan of Frank Furedi. I think Frank's still here. I read his Substack religiously. Hi, Frank. And look, if you look at what's happening in schools today, whether it's critical race theory or radical gender identity theory, We now have a large pile of evidence which shows, I think quite clearly, that the institutions are imposing a very specific political project on children that has no real basis in science, that has no real basis in empirical evidence. If you want some examples of that, I would urge you to engage with the group Don't Divide Us. They've shown through their work submitting freedom of information requests to British schools, and also by surveying the organisations that are brought in to teach children about issues to do with race and gender, that these are often dominated by a commitment to radical ideologies that really have no basis in the classroom, that should not be present. And they're certainly violating the legal requirement for schools to be politically impartial. So there is actually a battle taking place when it comes to schools. I've seen it in universities, but actually I'm much more concerned about what's happening in schools. And when people say, well, you're playing culture wars, don't believe them. Just look at the evidence at what is actually happening. And it's an example of the new graduate elite imposing this political project from above on everybody else. And it is a minority project. If you look at the British Social Attitudes Survey, the latest report, which came out, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, shows that the overall percentage of Britain's population that is strongly and consistently socially liberal is 20%. It is a minority political project, right, that is often opposed by the majority, who will say things like, I'd like to lower overall migration, I would like to slow the pace of change, I'm pretty balanced in how I view British history and identity and culture. I don't think it's all bad. I think there's some good stuff in there. I think probably we need to look at both of those things. But increasingly, people are sensing that they are being exposed to a political project which is not really sharing their values. And so if you look at the vote for Farage, if you look at the vote for Brexit, if you look at what happened in 2019, as all of the research has shown, contrary to what the new elite told you, that people didn't know what they were voting for, that it was about what was written on the side of a big red bus, it was about Dominic Cummings, it was about Russia, it was about Aaron Banks. The evidence is very clear. Statistically significant with people's desire to lower migration and people's desire to preserve their distinctive identity. Over and over again. My colleague John Curtis has found that, the British Election Study has found that, every serious academic study on those revolts has found the same thing, right? There was a very coherent demand for a different future through all of those rebellions, and the evidence on that is clear. So the new elite have really lost touch with people in terms of values, and they've lost touch with them in terms of voice, which is ultimately what NatWest and the Coote saga has become a symbol of. That essentially millions of people today, about 60% if you look at the YouGov polling, now feel that people like them cannot say what they really think because they're fearful of the consequences. 1 in 4 university students are now self-censoring in lectures and seminars, and we clearly have a problem with the public square. And my argument here is that that's because the institutions are dominated by people who are using those institutions to magnify their voice and simultaneously silence or stigmatize the voice of others who challenge this consensus. And you can see that in terms of the people who dominate those institutions. If you look at the media class, 90% of the media class now belong to typically the elite graduate class. Half went to Oxbridge. Local media has collapsed. Regional media has collapsed. The only way into the national media is essentially going straight from an elite university into the newsroom. The days when Andrew Marr wrote his book, My Trade, and talked about people coming up through the local media are gone. And there was a report this year by the National Union for Journalists which found that the media class today has never been as elitist as it is today, has never been as London-centric and as disconnected from the rest of the country. And that's just one institution. I can show you, as I do in the book, the same stats for publishing, the creative industries, museums, galleries, the universities. Where I work in the 1960s, the ratio of left-wing academics to right-wing academics was 3-1. Today it's 9-1. Okay, so you can go through the institutions and you can see over time how they've basically been reshaped around this new graduate class who have used these institutions, as we've seen with the debanking scandal, and as we've seen with the treatment of people like Kathleen Stock and others, to essentially stigmatize voices they disagree with. And that, I think, is what's been happening. And lastly, before I turn to how we fix all of this, this new graduate class have also really been putting together and installing a new moral hierarchy in society, a moral hierarchy in which the only people who now have social status, esteem, and honor are people who embrace radical progressivism and the way in which it views Western societies. If you do belong to the working class, if you belong to the white working class, if you're a conservative, a Brexiteer, in this new moral hierarchy, you essentially are at the bottom end of the new league table. At the top are virtuous minorities alongside their white graduate allies. And it's interesting that the people who say don't start a culture war talk about society as if they are already in a war, which I think is an interesting observation. But increasingly over time, this is really compounding a sense among many people that it's not just that they are being left behind economically, but they are now being left behind culturally and socially. They have the wrong identity, the wrong set of values, they have the wrong educational background in order to be taken seriously and to be respected within our society. And what worries me more than a lot of things worry me about Britain at the moment, from cost of living crisis to debt, which we need to talk about. The amount debt is costing us is just so frightening. But what also worries me is the way in which we are now speeding into the same framework, the same way of reshaping society as America, where the institutions are increasingly embracing these radical ideas without anybody forcing them to stop, pause, or reflect. An example last week was the school in London offering additional classes for black students that were not offered for white students, even though we know kids from the white working class are consistently the worst performers within the educational system. So a lot of this stuff is becoming quite entrenched, and it's going to be very difficult to root it out. Not impossible, as I'll come to, but it's going to be very difficult. So over time, the new graduate elite have been losing touch with the country in terms of the values they're imposing on the rest of us, in terms of the voices that dominate the institutions, and in terms of this new moral hierarchy, which really awards only some groups with virtue, some groups with social status, and leaves everybody else feeling that they're being left behind and are morally inferior. So what do we do about it? Well, I would like to see us get towards a future where the national conversation, first and foremost, reflects a much wider range of values and beliefs, and a range of values and beliefs that actually exist in wider society. One of the reasons we campaigned for the higher education bill, and one of the reasons why I'll never get a job at another university again, is because we wanted to ensure that at a minimum, people who might hold gender-critical or pro-Brexit or alternative views on British history cannot be sacked and persecuted and harassed simply because of their political views. At a minimum, we need to ensure that contrarians within the institutions cannot be removed. And that's one example, but I think ultimately we need some kind of mechanism like that across many other institutions in society. Ultimately, we need to reform the institutions. We need to get people from very different backgrounds, who have very different beliefs, who might not have passed through the same schools and the universities, into the BBC, and not just the junior levels, but into the editorial rooms, into the newspapers, into the museums, into the galleries. We need to shake up the public square in a very big way. When it comes to the schools, there's lots of things we need to do, but as a starter, we need to regulate the organizations that are being brought in to teach children. We need to have impartiality embedded in a more serious way in how we regulate and rate schools. If organizations won't provide their materials to children and won't let mum and dad see what materials are being used to teach their kids about race, sex and gender, then those organizations should be taken off the list and they should not be allowed to go into schools and teach kids. We need to I think, increasingly intervene, which is where some of us might start to go in different directions, but I really believe we need to start using the state to intervene in some institutions because they cannot be trusted to reform themselves. That was my experience with the universities. When universities become so dominated by one point of view, by one group, become so ideologically homogenous, they will never reform themselves. It will not happen. So if you look at the civil service, if you look at the universities, I'm afraid to say, this is where I depart from lots of my friends and conservatives, libertarians and others, I say, unfortunately, I think we need to start intervening in a much more serious and significant way. And I think ultimately, we need some kind of new movement in this country, which is outside of left and right, which is actually independent from the two parties and is not beholden to the same donor class and the same parliamentary intake as left and right. One of the biggest misconceptions of my book when it came out, everybody said, well, how can we have a new elite when we've had a Conservative government for 13 years? I say the Conservatives are as much a part of this group as the Labour Party. That if you look at how the incumbent Conservative government has allowed and indeed presided over much of this revolution to take place, from having a very relaxed attitude to radical progressivism, to putting the pedal down on mass migration, to opening up the doorway to hyper-globalization, the Conservatives are as much a part of this new elite as their Labour counterparts. And I do think we genuinely need to get to a place in this country where we do have a grassroots, bottom-up social movement of some description that is able to apply real, sustainable pressure to the two main parties in this and other areas. Because if I'm right and other people are right who have talked about the same process of polarization, this is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. This isn't about an election campaign. It isn't about a foreign actor. It isn't about a particular leader. Over time, this education polarization will go on, and it will accelerate. And I think increasingly, the people who dominate the epicenters of power, as we've seen since Brexit, will double down and backlash and radicalize in response to these kinds of rebellions, which is exactly what we've seen to now. And the chap who gave me his phone, that phone is now ringing. It's a great ringtone. I've got no idea how to turn it off on the phone. And that's the end of my talk. So convenient.